I'm Carmine Gallo. I'm speaking with retired U.S. Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is a legendary four-star admiral and former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Not only that, he has a PhD, highly decorated military leader. Maybe he'll show us some of his 50 medals during this conversation. Author of 10 books, and now he can add the title of New York Times best-selling novelist. The book 2034, a novel of the next World War. Admiral, it is a pleasure and honor to speak with you again.
It's always my pleasure to be with you, Carmen. Thanks for having me on. Every
time I speak to you, you seem to be adding to your resume. Can you cut it out? You make me feel like a laggard here.
I just like to keep busy, and I don't sleep a lot at night. Let's look at it that way.
This conversation is about leadership skills and the power of reading books, and why leaders need to develop both their writing skills and their speaking skills. Admiral, our paths have crossed from time to time because I am a big fan of your books. Leader's Bookshelf was one of the first ones. That's a permanent staple on my bookshelf. Leader's Bookshelf was one of the books that introduced me to you, but I love so many of your other books. I want to get into one you wrote last year as well. But you are also someone who has cited some of my communication books in your speeches and lectures. And I appreciate that because I write books with the intention of elevating leadership skills. So when someone like yourself cites my books, that's immensely gratifying. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. And I think in so many ways, the essence of leadership is the ability to communicate and inspire. And to do that, I think you have to be not only a good speaker, but a good writer as well.
And we'll get into those skills. Let's begin with the writing of your new novel, 2034, which you co-wrote, incredibly well received. Congratulations on the terrific reviews. More than 4,000 reviews on Amazon that I've seen, probably approaching 5,000 now during this conversation. It imagines a naval clash between the U.S. and China. Two questions, two obvious questions. Why 2034? And why are the protagonists the U.S. and China?
It's 2034 because I think that's the point, Carmen, where something dangerous will happen. And that dangerous thing is China's military capability will begin to truly overtake that of the United States. When that happens, it's conceivable that China might miscalculate and sleepwalk into a war with the United States, which would be in neither nation's interest. So the timeline has to do with the rising capability of China militarily. And then secondly, why a novel? You know, I could have written a 10th book of nonfiction. I wanted to reach a broader audience. I want to make this a cautionary tale of how devastating it would be both for the United States and for China if the two nations ended up in a war. And as far as why the US and China, history tells us again and again, when a current power is challenged by a rising power, 2/3 of the time those nations end up in a war. This goes back to Athens and Sparta, my own heritage. As recently as 100 years ago, established power, Great Britain, rising power, the Kaiser's Germany. How did that turn out in 1914? World War I, which led to World War II. We can still avoid that trap, but to do so requires active diplomacy and leadership.
One of your favorite quotes is, I believe, Napoleon, "A leader is a dealer in hope." Admiral, how hopeful are you that future leaders from the top down, through the military, through countries and organizations, how hopeful are you that future leaders can resolve conflicts?
Well, I love quoting Napoleon because I'm 5 feet, 5 inches tall on a really good day, and short people have to stick together at all times. So I like to quote Napoleon. And he did say, "A leader is a dealer in hope," which means as a good leadership skill, you ought to take the positive, upbeat approach. But let's face it, hope is not a strategy. And therefore, I am still cautiously optimistic that we can avoid a war with China, but not if we don't prepare, conduct the diplomacy, ensure that we have the military capability to deter China, work with our allies, partners, and friends. Overall, we need a strategy toward China. If we adopt that approach, again, I'm cautiously optimistic we'll avoid the events I describe in the novel 2034.
Well, this segues into leadership skills. Not every leader needs to be a New York Times bestselling creative fiction writer, but would you agree that every leader should strive to improve their writing skills?
Without question. And why is that? First, because you do write a lot as a leader. You're constantly banging out emails, you're writing a strategy, you're conducting interviews over a written medium, you're putting out daily messages to your troops using a variety of social networks. All of those are leadership skills that are critical. And as you know, something I've advocated for a long time, in order to be a better writer, your best course is to become a better reader. Because by reading good literature, reading both nonfiction and fiction, you can enhance your ability to communicate, both in writing, by the way, and verbally, as we're doing right now.
You became a voracious reader very early in your life. Your father was named the U.S. Navy attaché in Greece. So you began this lifelong journey starting at the age of 8, and you became a reader. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that journey took place and what it has meant to you in your career?
When I was 8 years old, we moved to Greece, and my father was assigned at the American Embassy. Uh, but here's the punchline. In Greece, in the mid 1960s, when I was 8 years old, there was no television. So when a typical American kid is developing that television habit in the 60s and 70s anyway, is when they're 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. In those years, I lived in a country, Greece, with no television. So every week, my mom would take me down to the English speaking library and I would check out books. And so every week I'd go home with a stack of books and they got increasingly more complex and longer. Both my parents were readers. I always lived in a house with books in it. And so it developed into a lifelong habit that continues to this day. It would be very rare for me to go through a year without reading at least 100 books. I read a book about every 2 to 3 days.
So you're reading 2 or 3 books a week, as do I. Explain to viewers, what role does reading play in a leader's ultimate success, regardless of what field they're in?
I think first and foremost, by diving into a book, particularly here, I'm going to choose fiction and historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
A book of that nature can become, if you will, a simulator where you can put yourself at the center of it and say, what would I have done? Think about Stephen Pressfield's magnificent novel, Gates of Fire, about the Spartans who make the commitment, the ultimate commitment, to fight and to die at the Battle of Thermopylae. Reading that book, you can put yourself in their shoes. You can understand their motivations. You can ask yourself, would I have the courage and the commitment and the honor to undertake that mission? You learn a lot doing that. Secondly, by reading history, you gain perspective. You can look back at previous times and apply those lessons of applied history. I often pick up the works of Thucydides, the Greek famous ancient historian, and his stories of the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Greece. A lot of what went into my novel, 2034, came out of that particular historical period. And third and finally, policy, current events. You can pick up a book by any number of brilliant scholars, and it's not quite the same as being in a conversation with Henry Kissinger, but you're reading the words and the philosophies and the ideas that he's communicated. Deeply important to understand. Again, when I decided to write this book, I reread Henry Kissinger's magisterial treatment of China. His book is called On China, and it helped me immensely as I prepared to write this book and as I continue to do commentary about US-Chinese relations. So there's 3 reasons, Carmen.
That reminds me of Eric Larson's books,
Yes.
like The Splendid and the Vile. I think you're fond of his books as well.
I am. I often refer particularly to one that is about pre-World War II Germany in the Garden of Beasts. And it is about the Nazi regime in Berlin. It's very illuminating. He writes, as you point out, history, but his flair as a writer makes it as pleasurable as reading the greatest of novels.
Admiral, you'll appreciate this. So I interviewed Eric last year when his book on Churchill came out, The Splendid and the Vile. And so I had a conversation with Mr. Larson, and I told him, darn you, I know the ending of your books, and it's still a page turner. How do you do it? He's that good of a writer.
He is. Another one in that category is Dead Wake, which
yes,
is about
that's what introduced me to him.
The sinking of the Lusitania.
You know how it ends.
You do. And on the other hand, in my mind, and I'm a naval officer and I think something of a historian, I had it in my mind that Lusitania was sunk, on a dark and stormy night in the middle of the Atlantic. It was sunk within sight of land on a sunny day. He just manages to grab details and bring them into the books just brilliantly.
I think it was President Truman who said, not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers. I think I would also add to that, based on my experience, leaders who read a lot of books, both fiction and nonfiction and historical, are more interesting communicators. They're innovators, they're pioneers, they bring a range of experiences to their teams and to their communication. And I'm thinking everyone from Steve Jobs to Jeff Bezos, who is a voracious reader and recommends books to his leadership team. Would you agree that the world's most innovative and inspiring entrepreneurs and leaders tend to read more than average?
Oh, indeed. And I can tell you with direct knowledge within the military profession, by the time someone has ascended to 4-star rank as a full general or admiral, it is very rare to encounter somebody at that level who is not a profoundly deep reader. One of my really close friends, someone about 5-6 years older than I am, but a mentor and also someone I was a peer with as a combatant commander, is Jim Mattis. We both have libraries that number in the thousands of books, and we often exchange book ideas. If you flip over the back of many of my books, you'll find a Jim Mattis blurb on the back. But I would say we are typical of very senior officers. And I think it's true that in any profession, be it the military or business or medicine or the law, again and again, I find people that go to the top so often are those who enjoy reading, enjoy talking about books as we are right here, and are therefore able to communicate, to share ideas, and again, to put themselves in the simulator that a book can represent.
In the hierarchy of the skills required of today's leaders, where would you put communication skills, both speaking and writing?
I think there are 3 fundamental skills for leaders that I would say are co-equal. One you just mentioned, that's communication. And here, not only your personal ability to write and to speak and to present, but also your ability to use the social networks to convey big messages, if you will, to scale communication. So that's one, communication. Co-equal with that, in my view, you mentioned a moment ago, Stephen Jobs, co-equal is innovation. Look, we can always find good, solid, wonderful men and women to do what in the Navy we would say, stand the watch. Just make sure the ship keeps moving forward, knee bone connected to the ankle bone, process. Those are great people and we need them. But leaders have to be innovators. So I would put innovation up there. And Stephen Jobs said, The difference between leadership and followers is innovation. And I think that's so true. So when I look at young officers coming along, I want someone who's going to come up with a new idea. And then thirdly, again, co-equal, these three. I said communication, innovation. The third one is collaboration, building teams.
Yes.
If I look historically at who were the great leaders, I think in the American context of two presidents who are without question our two greatest presidents, and that would be Abraham Lincoln, who guided us through the Civil War, and FDR. And I think, you put George Washington in sort of a special category as the founder president, if you will. But those two, if they had not lived, hard to imagine how this nation would have come through. In Lincoln's case, the Civil War, and in FDR's case, the Great Depression, Second World War. And both of them were consummate team builders. Read Doris Kearns Goodwin's incredible book, Team of Rivals, about the way Lincoln was able to meld together this disparate group, many of whom had run against him politically. Or look at FDR and how he was able to work with personalities as mismatched as Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, Joseph Stalin.
Stalin, sure.
Really?
Yep.
You want to sit around that table at Yalta and figure it out? But FDR did. And so I think collaboration, teamwork, if you will, is that third pinnacle skill. And I think it's those three together that I often talk about, communication, innovation, collaboration, that are the essence of leadership. Let me finish with one other thought, which is that all of that would be irrelevant if it did not rest on a base of values, of truth-telling, integrity, kindness to others. I love the quote by St. Augustine, "Be kind to all you meet, for you know not what burden they carry." Great leaders are like that. Democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, gender equality, racial equality. Look, we execute those values imperfectly, admittedly, but they're the right values. And I think a leader has to be grounded in those values and then have those pinnacle skills we just talked about.
You mentioned Doris Kearns Goodwin, the book Leadership in Turbulent Times, where she takes a deeper dive into several presidents, including Abraham Lincoln. She once said in one of the interviews after the book, what surprised her the most, even though she's written so much about Lincoln, and she said he was a great storyteller.
Oh, yeah.
So it kind of comes back to communication, innovation, and collaboration, equal weight.
I think so. And in that communication block, I think what Doris, who's a very dear friend of mine, I think what she might also have meant was not just a narrative storyteller, but an amusing storyteller. Lincoln could use humor to defuse tense situations, to puncture big egos, including his own status as the president. What a gift that is. And I think of some of the best leaders I've known really had that quality. And I'll give you two, which may or may not surprise you. One is President Bush Sr., if you will. Although, frankly, both Bush, father and son, were pretty funny. But Bush Sr. Really had a wicked sense of humor. And he was just fun to be around, even as, in my case, a very junior officer. And then I spent 2.5 years as the senior military assistant, effectively the military chief of staff for Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld. Now, you don't think of Rumsfeld, typically we don't, as a funny guy, but he is wickedly funny, very quick with a quip, very full of stories. I think it's a kind of a universal quality in really good leaders, that ability to use humor effectively.
Would you give my best to Miss Goodwin, Doris Kearns Goodwin? I have learned more, and I teach more about communication. I've learned more from her books, from her history books, than in any business book. So thank her for that, would you?
I will. She's just terrific. Her husband sadly died about 2 years ago. They had a lifelong, wonderful love story, and back to values. And Doris is just one of the most pleasant, kind people I've been around. And not to name drop, but I was lucky enough to be seated at a dinner party. How's this for a table? With the Queen of England, President Barack Obama, Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, myself when I was Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, a number of other people you would recognize, and Doris. And Doris was the delight of the table. She just ran the table, and she did it with the lightest of touches, but she engendered wonderful conversation, had funny telling stories. She was terrific, and that's Doris Kearns Goodwin.
I want to be at that table.
Yeah, we all do.
You wrote a book last year called Sailing True North, 10 Admirals and the Voyage of Character. Probably not surprising, I love the first chapter, which is on the power of persuasion. And you highlight an Athenian admiral in 4080 BC, Themistocles. And I never heard of him. He won one of the most important naval battles in ancient Greece, but you highlight Themistocles because of his ability to speak, his oratory, you say, deeply inspired the Greeks and the Greek Navy. And that was more than 2,500, 2,000 years ago. That just confirms that throughout all of history, great speakers can spark movements, can inspire, and they continue to do so today.
Indeed. And this was, in many ways, the most important battle, certainly of ancient times, but one of those battles that you can drop a plumb line to very different futures if it had gone another way. We could very well be conducting this interview in Farsi, in the sense that had the Persians overrun the Greeks, immense changes potentially could have happened. So the Greeks, who were a small, fractious, quarrelsome group of city-states, stood up to this enormous Persian Empire, and the Persian Emperor Xerxes sent a massive fleet, thousands of these triremes that you rode, and the Greeks were outnumbered 5-7 to 1. Historical accounts vary. But the night before the battle, Themistocles gathered his captains and his sailors, and he said to them in a very short speech, he said, tomorrow you must row, again, triremes, tomorrow you must row for your wives and your children. Tomorrow you must row for your parents. Tomorrow you must row for your city. And tomorrow you must row for freedom. And they won the battle because the Greeks were all free men, whereas the Persians, those oars were manned by slaves. And so it was a triumph not only of the oratory and the inspirational communications of Admiral Themistocles, but also it was a triumph of freedom over authoritarianism, totalitarianism, slavery, if you will. So it's a pretty powerful story, and it opens the book, Sailing True North, which is 10 admirals in the Voyage of Character. Being Greek American, I had to start with an ancient Greek admiral, so that's how he ended up in the book.
I love your stories. I love your wisdom, your advice, your books. Keep up your writing, Admiral, because the world needs your voice. Thank you so much. Nice seeing you again.
It's great seeing you, and please continue to inspire generations of leaders as you have to become preeminent communicators. It is at the heart of leadership, Carmen. Thank you.
Thank you.